Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good morning. Thank you. So my name is Dr. Jonathan Lightfoot. I'm the director of the Hofstra Center for Race, Culture, and Social Justice. We are pleased to partner with Hofstra Center for Civic Engagement under the directorship of Dr. Philip Dalton. We welcome you to the second installment of a series of community events designed to explore several hot topics that are currently gripping our nation at the intersection of race and policy. The COVID-19 public health crisis has torn away at the perennial scab of racial injustice and exposed the wounds of US hypocrisy around racism, poverty, violence, militarism, and other social, political, and economic manifestations of oppression, injustice, and equality. We are honored to have with us two key voices who will speak today on the topic of the school to prison pipeline. Sergio Aguetta is a leading voice in the Long Island activism community and beyond. He is also a high school dean, adjunct professor, social worker, and gang intervention specialist. Also leading today's discussion will be my doctoral student, Marilyn Jones Oliver, who is a middle school administrator in Albany, New York. She will share with us aspects of her dissertation study on the school to prison pipeline. Their collective wisdom and insight promises to enlighten and educate us on this pressing and timely issue. I'd like to thank all who have contributed to making this program possible, notably our former Associate Director of the Center for Race, Culture, and Social Justice, Dr. Benita San Pedro, our current Associate Director, Dr. Veronica Lippincott, Dr. Philip Dalton, and the advisory board members from the Center for Civic Engagement and the Center for Race. Finally, I'd like to thank our Provost, Dr. Herman Berliner, and Vice Provost, Dr. Maggie Abraham, whose valuable leadership helps the university centers to make Hofstra a more diverse, inclusive, and engaging campus community. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Philip Dalton. He's going to introduce our faculty moderator for today's session, Dr. Deborah Goodman, who is Professor of Literacy Studies and Specialized Programs in the School of Education. And one note I'd like to also remind you that next week, our third and final installment will be on Wednesday, September 23rd at the same time. We're going to explore the interesting work being done around the Innocence Project. Our roundtable discussion leader for that event will be attorney Vanessa Potkin, who's the Innocence Project Director of Post-Conviction DNA Litigation. She is responsible for representing and exonerating dozens of innocent individuals since the early 2000s. Dr. Dalton?
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Our moderator today is Dr. Deborah Goodman, Professor of Literacy Studies here at Hofstra University. Dr. Goodman taught for 15 years in Detroit public schools, working with multicultural city center populations prior to earning her PhD. She is past president of the Whole Language Umbrella and has chaired the elementary section steering committee of the National Council of Teachers of English. She is the author of The Reading Detective, a book inviting teachers and students to explore reading together. Her courses, presentations, and research interests include children's literacy, inquiry and critical pedagogy, language, culture and identity, literacy assessment and evaluation, language and literacy learning, and teaching readers who struggle. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Goodman.
Thank you. Is my mic on?
Yes.
All right. Prior to coming to Hofstra, I taught for 16 years in public schools in inner city Detroit, and I saw many families facing systemic racism, poverty, and homelessness. The K-8 students I worked with had loving families and lived in activist communities, but they often needed support services, even washing machines, adequate food, housing, safe places to play. They needed schools with clean bathrooms, adequate fundings for inquiry learning, strong science and social science programs, and arts programs to nurture talents and creative learning. Rather than finding a pathway to fulfilling futures, I saw many promising students offered a pipeline to prison and generational poverty. With this background, I'm particularly interested in the topic today. I want to welcome our two speakers, and I'll introduce both of them, and I thank them for joining us at this important forum. Sergio Aguetta is among the most influential community activists on Long Island. Mr. Aguetta is a leading expert on gangs and youth violence in the New York City, Long Island region, and has served as a gang specialist for the Nassau County Youth Board. He is a social worker at Uniondale High School and currently Dean of Students. He is an adjunct professor in social work at Adelphi University, Millersville University, and St. Joseph's College. Mr. Aguetta is founder and board president of Strong Youth Incorporated. Strong, which stands for Struggling to Reunite Our New Generation, is a youth, family, and community development organization specializing in youth and gang violence prevention and intervention. Mr. Aguetta is involved in many community initiatives, including a founding role in the Quarter Counts, which advocates for equity within some of the most marginalized communities in Nassau County. Our second speaker, Marilyn Jones Oliver, is currently an administrator in upstate New York. She's a doctoral candidate in Hofstra University's Educational Policy and Leadership Program, and hopefully is defending her dissertation this semester. As a sign of her dedication to learning and research, she traveled to Hofstra from Albany each week for her classes. She will share her dissertation study entitled The School to Prison Pipeline, School Leadership, Policy, and Practice. Ms. Jones Oliver writes that her research has caused her to rethink her role as a school administrator and compelled her to sound the alarm against the harm that schools are doing to people of color, especially Black males. As a roundtable, each speaker will make brief remarks to allow maximum time for questions. Please put any questions in the chat box, and I will use them for the discussion that follows. And turn it over to our first speaker.
Doc, I believe that's you, Doc. Am I going first? You want me to go first?
You're first.
Yes.
Okay, my apologies. I'm sorry. So good morning, everyone. My name is Sergio Aguetta. I'm the founder of Strong Youth, Inc., and I currently serve as a board chair, as was previously mentioned. I want to preface my statements this morning in paying homage to Mr. Arthur Morrison, who was an educator in the Hempstead school system for 30 plus years and was a fierce advocate for children that really, set a foundation for many of us that move it forward. So I also want to let you all know that I'm here in my capacity as a member of the Strong volunteer team. There are experts that are on this discussion right now that are representing Strong that could do a much better job, but they've given me the opportunity to give voice to some of the issues and challenges we deal with. In the interest of full disclosure, I am a dean at Uniondale High School here on Long Island. But none of what I'm talking about today is specific to my role. It really has to do with the 20 plus years of professional experience I've amassed, and also a lived experience and some of the things that I've been able to witness along the way with formal credentialing, but most importantly, the realities of which I've lived, and most importantly, the ones I sort of serve as witness to. So I kind of wanted to just set some parameters for the discussion and my comments today. First is, I'm here to speak to individuals that acknowledge this is a reality. I'm not here to convert non-believers, right? Oftentimes when we have these discussions, I think people are trying to get buy-in. If by this point, with everything that we have going on in our nation, you haven't come to terms with the fact that this is real, then there's nothing I could say to you in a span of 15, 20 minutes that's gonna make you wake up to that. The next thing is, don't take this personal. Those of us that oftentimes struggle with the realities of unearned privilege, right? We grapple with this idea of, this long-term belief that we get to where we are on our own principle and our own merit, without giving homage to the unearned privileges that we've gotten. I'm not, this isn't this is no single individual that's causing this, right? So it requires us to dig deep and kind of understand that. And the third is trust. I need you to trust that I'm not making this up. Trust that I didn't get up this morning and say, in the middle of my day, I'm going to join a panel and just speak without really knowing what I'm talking about. We don't have the time to necessarily build the type of trust that traditionally we all want to feel, right? But understand that there's a big enough body of knowledge out there where if you're really interested and you're open and you do these other things, you can definitely, get to where we are. So that's sort of like, my opening. I wanted to start off with learning that this is factual, right? Like kind of stating that this is factual. There's a nexus between the criminal justice systems and our schools, and we can no longer ignore it. Now, the inequities are deeply rooted in what is causing this school to prison pipeline to actually grow. So much of what we have we're currently dealing with has to do with a nexus between the criminal justice system and our school system, whether it's projecting how many beds future prisons are going to need based on educational attainment that certain kids are getting in the classroom today, whether it's understanding that if a kid fails to get a high school degree and move on into college or some sort of trade, they are more likely to suffer some real long-term consequences, or that these same individuals, if they don't graduate, will be introduced to the criminal justice system. It's real, as is the intersectionality when it comes to class, race, gender, sexual orientation. Each and every ism that manifests itself in our everyday world plays out in terms of this school to prison pipeline. And so it's extremely important for us to be critically aware, critically conscious, and most importantly, critically active as far as what we're going to do to make sure we address these issues. And so over the last couple of years, the context that we're going to use for my portion of the presentation has to do with the fact that we're here on Long Island, right? And when you think about Long Island and some of the significant challenges, I want you to think about some of our most marginalized groups. Who are they, right? Mostly students of color, mostly students of low socioeconomic status. We're talking about English language learners, students who have mental, physical, and learning disabilities, right? They're grappling with those realities. Those who don't have access to mental health, our LGBTQ youth, and our undocumented youth. Subpopulations of students that have to sort of navigate the significant challenges that exist within academia and in some of the communities that have been most marginalized and neglected. And so they have to navigate the school system. How does it work? Well, Long Island is among the most segregated suburbs in the entire nation. We have some of the most impoverished schools that are, less than a mile away from some of the best schools in the entire nation. Some of the worst performing schools next to some of the best schools in the entire nation. We also have some of the most affluent communities that literally border the most impoverished communities, the ones that lack the most amount of resources. And so this sort of fuels the frustration and the challenges that many of us who work in those marginalized communities grapple with, particularly as experts, right? In academia, as those charged with enlightening and empowering our students. A significant challenge that we have is that regardless of all of these challenges and issues that we grapple with as school administrators and teachers and individuals that work within schools, is the fact that we're not judged on the obstacles that so many of us have to work to overcome, but rather we're judged on metrics that truly don't capture the inequality and the inequity that exists and why it is that our children and our families and our communities struggle the way that they do. Those metrics, when we talk about exams and state tests, have only made these issues bigger. And as a result, the poor community, the communities that we work with, those under-resourced communities, are the ones that government has failed to address, are the ones where oftentimes government prescribes certain remedies without really thinking about the impact that it's going to have on those that can be deemed the voiceless, right? And so as a result, oftentimes what we grapple with and the challenge exists with the fact that all of these are societal issues. And in a segregated community such as ours, we have young people that grow up in communities where we go to different houses of worship. We don't really engage with one another. We go to different restaurants. We avoid and ignore each other, right? We don't really mix. We're not doing a great job of breaking away at that segregation. But the one social institution that mostly all children are forced to sort of grapple with or navigate, including families and adults, is oftentimes that school system. And so now we are the recipients, and that's a quote from a great friend of mine and colleague, Ms. McFadden, who talks about we as school administrators, as people that work in academia, in the schools, we are the recipients of everything, of all the significant challenges that have been ignored for way too long. And when it comes to us sort of grappling with all these things and being held up to these various metrics, we have to come up, and no resources, we have to grapple with how do we address these issues, right? And so these are some of the ways that these things kind of manifest itself. And we sort of have to figure out how it is that we're going to work on these significant challenges. Now, these elected officials are the ones that prescribe these rules and regulations, and they tell us what we have to do without providing those resources. And as a result, we grapple with how do we address the inequities. In poor communities, the biggest veil that is being used is that of safety. And so as a result, there's funding for things such as security apparatus. And so some of the grants that come down will allow you to prescribe metal detectors, right? And buy screening equipment and beautiful airport screening machines with no funding for extracurricular services or even the experts that are truly needed within our buildings that could address the mental, the social, and the emotional needs of our children, particularly the most marginalized, right? And so think about it, regardless of how good that metal detector may be, if inside of prison walls, right, if inside of some of our most maximum security prisons, we have individuals that can still get drugs and weapons in, what makes us think that these detectors will ever truly detect what is really going on with our children, right? And so we sort of implement these different, you know, we put together these systems that allow us to a false sense of security, because in all reality, what I tell my folks is that no matter what we do, where there's a will, there's a way, and until we address the will, we won't be able to provide for the safety of our children. And so what else do? We talk about bringing in SROs, right? Nassau County, Suffolk County, village police officers that with a 60 college credit, no, not demeaning anyone here. I used to be a criminal justice major, right? My associates is in criminal justice. No disrespect to him, but with 60 college credits earning six-figure salaries, but I have individuals with multiple master's degrees or PhDs that are coming in at half the salary. And so what are those? Those are conscious, critical decisions that society is making, right? That is a value given, value added that elected officials are saying these individuals are worth this amount of money. But those that do this type of work, that have this type of training, that are constantly reinventing themselves and working on getting better are not worth that. And so that pretty much talks to where our value system is. And it requires us to recognize and realize, are we going to allow this to continue to happen? And as a result, not only do we build this apparatus that only attempts to address the symptom, right, without addressing the core issues that our kids are facing, we continue to build the monstrosity and we codify it. So the same way the criminal justice system creates mandatory minimums, there are certain things that we will not tolerate within the school system. Now, I'm not here to have a debate as to what the justifiable sort of penalties should be for any act. There's certain things that, you know, I kind of feel a little schizophrenic at times, because as I get older, I gain a little bit more knowledge, and sometimes I find myself being quite conservative, where I'm like, oh my God, who are you, right? And sometimes I'm a little bit more liberal on certain things. And depending upon what hat I'm wearing, right? As an advocate in the streets, when I'm talking about this kind of stuff, I can be real with you and keep it raw. But when now all of a sudden now I'm responsible for the safety of 2,300 students and hundreds of staff members, and I know the realities of what we're dealing with, well, you know, my belief system changes. And so it's not to say I'm hypocritical, but it's really that struggle, that tension, that push-pull factor that exists, but we can't shy away from that struggle. And so we codify mandatory minimums, so the same way the drug laws did, right? And so if you commit this type of act, this type of crime, you are out. You're gone. I don't want to see you. Or you're suspended for X amount of days, or you have to go through these processes. And seldom, if ever, are the schools that need the most provided the resources that will help reintegrate those students, right? And as a result, we know that students that get suspended and get expelled are spending less time in the school system and are less likely to complete that journey. And we know that they're going to be grappling with further impediments. We also know that if you don't graduate high school, you're going to end up engaging in antisocial behaviors that will eventually lead to some sort of criminal justice introduction, whether it's the juvenile justice system, whether it's probation, whether it's incarceration, right, at the local jail or the prison or federal. And once you get that label, I don't care what they tell you. I don't care about this idea of sealed records and this and that. I'm a 42-year-old man. I have a bunch of credentials. I don't even want to list them all because they're boring, right? And I could tell you that at the age of 42, when I apply for certain positions, I still have to write down what I did when I was 14, 15, 16 years old, right? And blessed was I that the laws weren't what they are now, because there is no doubt in my mind that had I been a 14-year-old this day and age, engaged in the same type of misguided, misleading path that I was on, right? I wouldn't be here. I would have been denied of all those opportunities. And so these are the kinds of things that we have to grapple with, the consequences of decisions. Nothing will change until we as a society, right, decide we are going to reconfigure ourselves. We're going to sort of find our ethical and our moral obligations about caring for our kids. The idea of blaming young people for the world they've inherited without acknowledging the failures of those of us that are over the age of, I don't know, I'm 42, so I'll say 40, right? But I could tell you that this has been going on for decades. And so it is not until now that we have this unapologetic youth movement that is cross-fertilization between, that crosses all racial, ethnic, so, I mean, you name it. These young brothers and sisters that are out there on the front lines saying no, defund, abolish, whether it's police, whether it's ICE, right? Whether it's this idea that other individuals are not worthy of dignity and, and the worth of every person. Individuals that are tired in their young 15, 20, 25 years to life, how they could articulate how their moral compass is so on point that they could say this is not right and we're not going to stand for it. And so as a result, I know I have colleagues here, Elaine from another state outside of New York. I got my brothers and sisters in the social work field. My strong family is on here, as well as educators that are responsible. Sherelle, I see you, right? And Michelle and Charles Fox is here. These are individuals that are on the front lines every day, but each and every last one of us plays a role. And so it's critically important for us to say, we cannot allow this to continue to happen. We also need to start understanding that the trust and the collaborative effort needs to be community and school working together to truly address these issues. Those in academia, my brothers and sisters here that have an influence in the schools of education, we need to update those course requirements. We need to start thinking about courses that really address these issues, particularly at the administrative level. There are multiple programs and none of them are talking about the inequities in education based on the realities of what my people see in those classrooms every day. And so I hope I haven't bored you. But I can tell you that I'm looking forward to the question and answer period, and I can't wait to hear that research. That I'm gonna salute Dr. I'm gonna put it out in the air now, Dr. Marilyn Jones Oliver. The mic is now yours, sister. I hope I did you justice in preparing you, in preparing the platform, warming them up.
Thank you so much. I want to again say to Dr. Jonathan Lightfoot, my cheerleader, thank you very much. That's my man, okay? And I don't mean that, you know how I mean that. I appreciate him. He pushes me and I appreciate him. And so again, Marilyn Jones Oliver, I'm an assistant principal completing a doctorate in educational policy and leadership study at Hofstra University. The dissertation title is The School to Prison Pipeline, School Leadership Policy and Practice. My dissertation committee includes my chair, Dr. Jonathan Lightfoot, Dr. Eustace Thompson, Dr. William J. Mangino, Dr. Tamika Robinson, and Dr. Leonard Slade. My abstract defines the school to prison pipeline as the tracking of students from their schools directly into the juvenile and adult criminal justice system, primarily due to zero tolerance policies. Thank you, Sergio, you understand that. A review of the literature indicates that there's a disproportionate number of Black male students who are at risk for receiving a negative educational experience. While many scholars have studied the impact of implicit racial bias in educational and other institutional settings, this study seeks to explore the impact of explicit racial bias on the educational experience of Black male middle school students. Research shows that Black males receive higher rates of suspensions, harsher discipline, and more special education referrals than that of their similarly situated white counterparts. School administrators, like myself, may adopt a position of zero tolerance to justify their application of policies that purport to be colorblind. But in fact, they work against the academic achievement and persistence of Black males in particular. The critical race theory is an analytical framework which illuminates the social construction of race and pervasiveness and permeates racism. Therefore, this study will use CRT as a lens to establish a connection between Black males in middle school, school leadership, and application of zero tolerance disciplinary policies. Additionally, the study employed a qualitative semi-structured interview method as a qualitative data collection strategy. My research question is, what are the perceptions of school leaders regarding how zero tolerance policies, zero tolerance disciplinary policies, and explicit racial bias affects the academic achievement and persistence of Black middle school boys? The analytical framework CRT allows the researcher to examine the tenet, which states that racism is pervasive. The United States is founded on this American history. Racism continues to pervade American society and is deeply ingrained in American life. Schools are no different in how racism affects the persistence of Black males. Storytelling is one of the tenets of CRE, and it allows the researcher to flip the script, if you will, or reinvent the narrative and provide a clearer view of the effects of racism in school. Now, I love a lot of our Black authors, and specifically Michelle Alexander, Gloria Ladson-Billings represent a few authors that I've used on my lit review for this study. These authors write extensively about effects of racism and how it impacts Black males and their status in society. In Michelle Alexander's book, for instance, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, she discusses this very fact, how dropping out of school increases the likelihood of Black and brown males becoming part of the criminal justice system, where they are products of this mass incarceration and are disproportionately arrested for minor criminal offenses in comparison to their white counterparts. Gloria Ladson-Billings and Tate posit in their work of Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education that race continues to be a significant factor in determining inequity, Sergio, in the United States. And as stated earlier, the study employed a qualitative, semi-structured interview methodology as a qualitative data collection strategy. Now, due to the pandemic, the early and scary days of it, it was quite difficult for me to find study participants. However, as a result, schools were closed, which made it difficult for me to contact them. After much angst, I was finally able to secure a Black male superintendent, a Black female assistant superintendent, 3 principals, which included 2 Black male principals and a white male principal, 3 assistant principals to include 1 Black male, 1 female, and 1 Hispanic, and 2 focus groups. These focus groups included 3 Black female teachers. A second focus group included 2 white male teachers and a white female. Now, In this study, my greatest find was an appearance of a distinct racial color line that divided the Black study participants and the white study participants. The Black study participants understand how zero tolerance policies and special education referrals impact Black and brown middle school boys and how they're vulnerable to getting caught up in the criminal justice system. Whereas the white study participants failed to see the connection here. I used the following sample protocols to ask participants of their interest and their thoughts around these questions. How does zero tolerance disciplinary policies affect academic achievement of Black middle school males? And were they referred for special education? And if so, what were their ethnic and racial identities? In conclusion, while participants of this study failed to see the connection between zero tolerance policies and unfair special education referrals, I submit to you a possible reason for this disconnection could be related to participants' inability to even comfortably broach the subject. I found that a lot of them, specifically the whites, were very cautious to answer certain questions. They didn't feel like they could say it based on the climate that we're in. It's hard to solve a problem that you can't admit you have or even truly exists. Truth and reconciliation require one to first admit and tell the truth, then figure how to handle and reconcile the damage caused by a lie for so long. Now, did this study answer my question? What are the perceptions of school leaders regarding how zero tolerance policies and explicit racial bias affects the academic achievement and persistence of Black middle school boys? If not, then I should hope I have at least shed some light on an important issue and encourage future researchers and scholars to build on what you've heard from me today. Thank you.
Thank you to both speakers. I'm very impressed with the work and how much you were able to, how much information you were able to give us and how you were able to lay out these issues and important studies in just a few minutes. I want to encourage everybody, if you have a question, to write it into the chat box. I have a couple questions to start us off, and I'll try to keep an eye on the chat box for other questions. Picking up on zero tolerance policies, I think that is one thing that we often, bring in, sometimes even in terms of, for example, protecting LGBT students, that there's zero tolerance of bullying or this type of thing. Can each of you talk a little bit more about how these policies maybe fail to recognize issues of systemic racism or, the kind of balance between education and sort of punitive responses to students in schools?
If you want to go first, Marilyn, I'll defer to you. If you want me to jump in, you let me know. I'm all good.
Thank you. I feel primarily because of how the zero tolerance has affected Black males, and I think this is what you're asking me, or students of color, period. For instance, I've had students come in my office because of issues that I feel are subjective, and the teacher can merely talk them through it and they can go back to class. I've seen students who have people on the board, and because the parents on the board, then this means that they don't get the same consequence that, say, a Black student would be because the parent on the board is white. And so I think that it has impacted in such a way that in other words, school systems have dug such a hole now until it's kind of hard to get out, because it's like Sergio was saying earlier, this young group, they're in your face. They're saying this is wrong. And so in schools, it needs to be said that too. With all that's been going on, now we want to read books, we want to try to do anti-racism and all these things that we feel can help us. Personally, I don't feel like I need to say a whole lot about it. I'm Black 24/7, 365. So, whatever you see me, then I don't feel like I need to explain things. But right now, everybody wants to know, well, what do you feel? How are you feeling? Well, I'm going to let you answer that. So I don't know if I answered your question. I hope so. But I'm really galvanized right now. And so I'm trying to make sure I stay focused on your question. I hope I answered it.
I'll follow in and jump in on that. I think that the impact of the zero tolerance policies are failing to do two things, right? Provide, we use it as a veil that we're really protecting classes that have been oppressed and marginalized, when in reality, I mean, we marginalize and oppress people in every facet, every profession, and to somehow think that we're going to be able to solely protect by expelling the individuals that may be sort of harming or hurting as a result of the lack of understanding, right? So here I am, I'm going to treat you bad. I'm going to oppress you. I'm going to even hurt you. I'm going to threaten and bully you. And so what I do with you is expel you instead of attempt to enlighten you. Instead of realizing that this is the only place where you get any type of exposure to diversity, right? Study after study that looks at hiring practices by districts, and the fact that on Long Island, most of our districts are either 90% of color or 90% white, right? Yet the individuals teaching and working within those structures are still solidly Caucasian. And there's this, and just to be real clear, to just talk about it from a race perspective or race lens dumbs it down, because I work with colleagues who are white, who come from some affluent communities, but their ability to empathize and digest and they grapple with their privilege and they're in tune with it. And they stand up more for the children than certain individuals that look like them, right? And so it's a nuanced approach and perspective. And I think that the push for restorative practices, the real implementation of restorative practices is one where when I cause you harm, I get to learn from that harm. I grew up in Hempstead. Being a Latino back then, my mother was is a Salvadorian immigrant, right? Who came here in the 70s. Back then, when you saw Latinos, you would call them Puerto Ricans. And it was a predominantly African-American and Latino community. And when I'm telling you, I'm deeply rooted in a Afro-traditional culture with some phenomenal educators that instilled in me a sense of love and pride and resilience, right? Now, all of a sudden, I get to the middle school and my skin tone becomes an issue. And African-American students used to beat up and bully Latino kids, and they failed to address it. So what we did was we decided we were going to protect ourselves. And it fueled this nasty sentiment between African-American and Latino students. And there was conflict. And because of the failure of addressing it, we dealt with it on our own. And it was a horrific way to approach it. And guess what it resulted in? Individuals my age of a different race, a lot of violence, hospitalizations, death. It was this past September 11th was the 25th year since my best friend passed away when I was 17 years old, killed, 19 years old, shot in the head. And when you look back at that, you're like, damn, so many lost opportunities. But it was the adult failure. So it requires us to grapple with it and understand, okay, now how do we do this?
And in addition to that, make them feel like they belong into the building. Let them feel like they belong part of the community, the student community. Sometimes that's what the kids lack. They don't feel like they are cared about by the teacher or whomever. So what they do is whatever it is to get attention.
I grew up in Detroit public schools and then taught in Detroit public schools for years. And I think the police presence in the schools, even as a teenager, which was in the 60s and 70s, was one more thing that caused kind of a sense of disenfranchisement of youth from school. And so I think what you're talking about with both some of the reform policies that are introduced and the let's see, what did you say? SROs is the officers who are in the schools. I recently read an article about Florida schools that have now introduced and are spending a lot of money on police presence in the schools. There's more police in schools now than every school has a police officer more. And ironically, it's a response to shootings in schools, but it has led to more students being directly, not even a pipeline, arrested in school, including 5- and 6-year-old children. Can you talk a little more about the restorative practices that you introduced and what those look like?
So, I mean, I think most of us are familiar with the concept of restorative practices. I think that one of the things that Strong recently did in the past year was we brought individuals from the West Coast. We're big on not reinventing the wheel. We're a grassroots organization that believes in instituting and developing programs that are innately connected to the indigenous roots of the young people that we grapple and that we work with and provide services to. So our staff here, and it was opened up to various partners, began engaging in what we call sort of restorative practices with indigenous traditions. And so Compadres Network is the organization we work with, and our individuals, so many of my colleagues from Wyandanch, Ms. Demori, and I see Linda Milch. I'm blushing here. I haven't seen my comrades in so long. But these are the practices, right, that require us to sort of get in tune with that self-healing work. So many of us that work with kids carry the trauma, right? So when Marilyn says, ask me why don't you think about how I feel, right? That's the reality of what we've been carrying, right? Those burdens, if you will. And so as a result, so much of the work is trauma-informed practice that allows individuals to sort of reflect and work through the trauma that we've experienced, whether it's the interpersonal trauma within our own homes, outside of our homes, the trauma that society has inflicted on us. I'm reminded of Doc Rivers, who had who cried and showed emotion a few weeks ago and said, "Why does my country not love me the way I love it after everything it has done to me," right? And so there's this almost abusive relationship that exists until we start acknowledging that we've been through trauma, that our nation, that our communities, that elected officials, both Republicans and Democrats, right? Because those are the real gangsters in my community, right? Until we acknowledge that we're harnessing and carrying this, and then find a space such as this one, as varied and as diverse, to say we're going to partner on this together, because that is truly what is astonishing about what creates real change. Is we've already known this. Our brothers and our sisters in the 60s or in the 20s, whenever, whatever movement that was involved, they knew that this is what those individuals sort of fear. And when we start framing the issues in such a way where, the restoration of the human spirit, of human dignity, of each and every human life is critical to our existence. And I'm gonna tell you, it's in certain communities, it looks different. So it's not just race, right? So if I'm in the boroughs, predominantly African-American and Latino districts, run top to bottom, let's say, even a little bit more diverse in the teaching population. If all of a sudden I have a kid, who comes from a European country and has seen war-torn countries and is dealing with the trauma of rupture and reunification and is now grappling with that and no one's helping them, that kid is an oppressed and marginalized kid, right? Regardless of skin. I have kids in very affluent communities that are African-American, Latino. They're going to deal with some challenges, but they might oppress people that look just like them based on class. So it requires us to take that nuanced approach and dig deep and hunker down on these guiding principles that say, we're not only going to restore the individual, we're going to work with the family, and we're going to work with the social institutions that are really charged with the most important duties and responsibilities of enlightening and empowering our children.
Following up on that, Patricia Kessler wanted to know if you would repeat the organization that works more on restorative practices. And she says she's been trained in restorative practices, but can't find opportunities to use what I learned by shadowing those that are practicing.
So, Strong Youth works with Compadres Network. My sisters and brothers who are on here, feel free to share the other colleagues that we've worked with throughout the nation. We've had individuals from Chicago come down to visit with us, and we're, you know, so there you know, there's various individuals, but the Compadres Network is an organization that definitely comes to mind, and Akil Bashar from out there in California as well does a lot of work in the Compton area with that kind, and so much of it is, you know, what's interesting is that so what they've been able to do is frame it in such a way that it allows us to reach the kids we work with, right? But this is, it's a part of pedagogy, like in specific professions. We're just not applying it we're not only are we not applying what we're learning, but we're also not taking the indigenous traditions that exist within our communities and a strength-based approach to how we deal with the work. And I think that's what's beautiful. Strong is developing and massaging a philosophy and learning how to adapt what works elsewhere to the ones we work with. And there's some things we have to leave and other things that we embrace. And we say, wow, this is what we've been missing, right? So it just looks different. And then we apply it to our personal lives, because the idea is we want to end, you know, with the cycle, and we inflict so much of this on our own children. And so when I tell you schizophrenic tendencies, I'm quite liberal in the community. When I'm dealing with my 11-year-old daughter who thinks she's 21 and my 5-year-old daughter who swears she's 25, I'm quite conservative, right? So, but how do you break that? How do you stop, you know, and acknowledge your bias, your implicit bias, your explicit bias, the messaging? All of it is critical to liberation, in terms of really inspiring and impacting the next group of young people.
Can you talk about some of the projects? And I don't know, Marilyn, if in your reading, if you also want to add, but as a representative of Strong in particular, what are some of the projects that you're involved in the community with youth, and perhaps other organizations that you think are engaged in projects that are addressing these issues?
So, I mean, so Strong has a number of school-based programs, right? It's how we get to know so many of the individuals on the screen here. They're partnering with various districts that have opened their doors, and you know, all of those programs are at different levels based upon, you know, building on that trust and sort of, you know, learning from one another, give and take. The ones that are the most fruitful collaborations are where there really is no separation between our partnerships, and others, you know, you sort of have to respect the boundaries and the lay of the land within those certain communities. So there's school-based programs. There's a big family component that has been instituted over the last, you know, I'd say 5, 6, 7 years over the, you know, as a result of the leadership of our executive director, who is phenomenal, Resmia Zatar, who, you know, a dual psychology master's with social work and a passion for criminology and really understanding it. She understood that until we do family work, we weren't going to get very far. So she, with Michelle, who's on this conversation here, and is also had done some work with Hofstra and Adelphi, some of the schools. They built a component where they had an elementary school program, and you know, they were engaging the entire family with our elementary school kids, and they're empowering them by way of media, you know, using media to really transform. Right now, we're in Strong Studios, right? They have a video program, a radio program, a music program. They've taken these young kids and they're empowering them to be organizers. So they're leading marches, and they're creating videos that are then shot to elected officials who are then requesting meetings with them. So there's a youth and family empowerment, creating opportunities for them to spend time together now. And so much of it is home-based. So they're going out into the communities and into the homes. We also have what we call our intervention is Strong University. We have intervention workers, many who have served some serious time behind bars. The idea of redemption is at the core of what we do, right? And so these young men and women who have served serious time for various crimes, many of them that can be deemed heinous, have, you know, paid their debt to society as far as what was prescribed, and now they're going above and beyond as far as enlightening and empowering young people that were walking down the same path and trying to divert them from that. So they take them on trips to certain spaces. They provide mental health counseling. We have intervention services, just a bunch of things that so many of my strong family here could do so much better, and those that partner in answering. But that, in a nutshell, that's some of the work that we do.
And there are some things that we do here, but not so much now with COVID and everything, 6 feet distancing and no touching and all of that. But we're part of actually I was part of CAB, a community accountability board, where we see some students who've had issues outside. They'll come in with a team of about 4 or 5 of us sitting down, listening at what they've done. And so therein we deal with some restorative practices to help them, come back and understand how to navigate through the system once back. And we also partner with mentoring programs. But again, a lot of that has changed since COVID.
And while you're, let me just follow up with a question that maybe as an administrator you could address is somebody asked, how do we get school districts to buy into restorative justice and practices instead of exclusionary disciplinary practices?
I believe if we can, and we know, I think if you read enough research about education and what it looks like today, our educational system is staffed by white, female, middle income women, white women, who, let's just say it, just be honest, they don't always connect with our children, our Black kids. So often when the student is coming or saying something to them, they think disrespectfully, then they want the administrator to, say something to them or suspend them or whatever. And I've had teachers say to me, well, Marilyn, what are you going to do? And I'm thinking, well, what are you going to do? You're in the classroom with them. Do you have a relationship? It's important to have a relationship with the student. So I think the first step is to get the teacher to understand, teach your student, your Black and brown student, like you with your own child. What would you do with your own child? I think that's the first step. Once the teachers buy into it, then the district's job will be easier. I've been in meetings where teachers just turn their back or they don't want to have anything to do with the kids. It was one situation, we had a student coming in and he was a problem. And so what I wanted to do was go to the home, sit down and talk with the parent, with the aunt actually, and teacher would bring a class management so that the classroom management rules so the student can get to know her, etc. And she said, oh, I don't go to children's homes. So the first step is to get teachers to understand if you're in urban ed or any suburban or whatever, then you need to understand that as a teacher, it's okay for you to do these things. Of course, we have the union who would, slap your hand about that. But, I think that's the first step. And hopefully the district can understand, in order to move the needle, everybody has to buy into this. And we know that there's racism. Talk about it, try to figure out how we can all come together, kumbaya, something, I don't know. But in the meantime, we have children who are not learning because we got these issues. Adults have these issues.
I think that part of it requires us to have some real earnest dialogue, right? And so much of it is heavy work. So let's start off with some of the light stuff. I think schools of education need to sort of look at the spaces in which courses need to start infusing more mental health approaches. But as a social worker, I'm gonna tell you that we had to talk about inequality. We had to, and it became a part of our everyday vernacular. And when we were seeing things play out in our own homes, right, we were able to call that out, like, yo, that's racist, right? That's sexist, right? Like that's discriminatory. And it allows you to then now be able to identify these things and work towards it. And it can't be one course. It literally has to be infused in your curriculum in each and every course. So if you're talking about, assessment, well, let's talk about implicit bias in assessments. Let's talk about who creates these tools that now we hold. My daughter in her second day of school in a pretty good school district takes some sort of diagnostic where she gets on her second day of virtual class, gets an assessment that says she only got 2 out of 10 right. She only got 2 right out of 10. And now she's like, oh my God, this is middle school. And what am I going to do? And I was like, what? Like, relax, right? And I had to thank God that I have the ability and the understanding. My partner does as well, right? And we're both in education, and we're postmasters, and we have a support network of abuelitas and abuelos and aunts and uncles where we're going to instill that pride in them. But if they don't, so someone needs to have a conversation with that teacher and say, do you recognize what this little assessment tool can do to one of the few brown girls in a classroom, right? Who's already getting messaging that math and science isn't for girls, right? Who's already getting all these little things that may slip out of my mouth once in a while when I call her beautiful instead of acknowledging her wisdom, right? And these amazing things that she has. And so it's the responsibility of these schools that are preparing these individuals to get them there. It's also imperative that school systems and leadership from the board down to whatever minor position to talk about parallel processes that exist, right? So when we talk about, having some real discussion about, working in communities that you don't necessarily have a connection with, to no fault of your own, right? So if you look at a person growing up on Long Island, chances are you're in a segregated school district. Chances are you're going to go to a college that is not diverse, especially when it comes to curriculum. You're probably going to get placed in schools where, you may not have particular populations, or even, sometimes the assumptions, oh, because you look a certain way, you'd be a good fit over there, right? So we have these same programs and training processes that perpetuate the inequities, right? And magically we sort of say, okay, how do we get the buy-in? The buy-in doesn't happen until we take the conversation where it needs to, and we are deliberate and take the time and have the patience to really work through it. So people that believe in implementing these solution-based programs, equity, the discussion around equity, all that kind of stuff, what you see manifest is the ones that are legit, that are taking this and they're committed to it. It evolves and it flourishes. And so, and it's also important to recognize the entire system doesn't necessarily have to do it. Sometimes it's just that one person. So I have security guards, I have lunch monitors, I have custodial staff. I've worked with individuals across Long Island that are in those professions that do a phenomenal job at engaging in this type of practice. So it's not just at the micro level, the macro level, but that meso level, being able to navigate all of that, that's really effective in how you get buy-in.
Connected with that, a question was posted early on saying, many are saying they want to learn more about the struggles faced with systemic racism, but also, like you discussed, become uncomfortable when those discussions finally occur. How, as someone who has fielded these discussions, do you suggest that people wanting to learn more approach these important conversations?
Personally, I feel, and I think it's important I have no problem speaking about it. I think you probably figured that out. And I try to make others, my white counterparts, feel comfortable about it at the same time. But I guess my issue is, if you're coming into the conversation making assumptions, that's where we're going to have a problem, because you just can't assume, that you know exactly what to say, because it's been proven that sometimes when you're in these very difficult and challenging conversations, whites don't always say the right things. And I have struggled with that, because in my mind, I'm thinking, well, you have to know what to say and what not to say. But one of my colleagues corrected me, and she said, Marilyn, if you haven't grown up around Blacks and you've been in suburbia all your life or around whites, then you might not know. And so I checked myself on that. And I think it's important for both parties to come together, understanding, don't make assumptions.
I think that, I echo some of that sentiment. I think that so much of this requires that we carefully walk those landmines. If you're going to be the one leading the discussion, you have to be comfortable in how you grapple with this. I've spent when I made a switch from the nonprofit sector to Adelphi University as the administrator and the director of the BSW program. I was there for 3 years, right? I had to learn, I mean, talk about sink or swim, right? And I could tell you that I was going to navigate that environment and succeed and achieve everything I needed to. And I was, you know, it was a welcoming sort of experience as far as my being able to develop my craft. But being able to sort of think about how you're going to navigate these issues if you're the one leading it, and most importantly, just taking time out to understand that I'm not a fan of sort of I'm not going to appease you, right? I'm going to make you struggle and grapple, and you're going to have a tough time, but I'm going to work with you, right? Because we need allies. And you know, for me, it's been interesting to hear and see, and I've grown tremendously, I think, from when I was 20 years old to now being 42, right? Where now I'm trying to sort of impart some of this wisdom on my younger folks, right? And being able to sort of say, okay, how do we establish common ground? How do we get there, right? The idea of we're all going to make mistakes. I'm going to say something that may offend you based on, you know, the way you interpret or the way you hear or even the way I expressed and what I actually may have meant, right? Because, you know, we are not kind to each other. We don't embrace one another. We don't embrace other perspectives. The yin to the yang is extremely important, you know, and even understanding in the way we speak. So always understanding the other's perspective, that sense of empathy is critical to the work. So just being able to, you know, to sort of grapple with that, with our own biases, right? You know, I have relatives that are racist, that are sexist, that say some things, you know, that I can't imagine. Some of the people that I love the most, my mother imparted and said things to me, whether consciously or unconsciously, that had a damaging impact in terms of the way I viewed the world. But it was taking her view and perspective, you know, and knowing that she got a third grade education, but still had enough resilience and wisdom to make it and do all these wonderful things that she was able to provide for me. It's taken that wisdom, that love for cultura and el pueblo, and incorporated it into my own life, that makes it where I'm going to take that beautiful part of it and do this for my daughters. And I'm also going to have to continue dealing with those things I grapple with every single day. So it's a continuous cycle. It's a learning, and, you know, it's going to take some serious work, but it can be done. It can be done.
And I think, Marilyn, you were referring before to critical race theory being grounded in narrative. And one of the things that, or I think I'm quoting you correctly, you can correct me in a minute if I'm wrong. And one of the things that I often use with students as a teacher educator is literature and story, you know, to help teachers explore things from another perspective. And I find that story keeps the complexity, the systemic nature of our interactions, as opposed to, you know, a simple, you know, zero tolerance type of, it helps us problematize some of those racism and other issues. You want to say more about that?
I agree with that. As a matter of fact, I was reading a lot regarding the storytelling and how it plays out in critical race theory. And sometimes using those types of lessons and stories kind of help us understand where we are as a society and how we can help move our society in a progressive direction. Because I think when we're looking at where we are today, and I think about what Sergio was saying, immediately I thought in my mind about how I was in a meeting, a Google Meet, Zoom Meet, much like this, and we were talking about anti-racism. And one of the administrators, as she was sharing her view, and I see some of the comments about how white people can feel, she started to cry. And I was reading D'Angelo's book and how she talks about what white women do for the most part is they tend to cry as they're the victim, when the best thing to do is understand what's being asked of you, or how to converse in the conversation without the tears, because it's really not about you as much as it about the healing process. And so in storytelling, I remember having read a story regarding a student who was in a classroom, and when the teacher came to talk to him about his work that he was doing, she didn't have any prior knowledge, so she had no idea that he came to school after dropping his friend or his brother off, and so he became the parent in the family. And so the story goes on that as the teacher was approaching his desk, he begins to get upset because she says, "Get to your work, get to your work." She eventually, he, said some choice words to her, and eventually he was suspended as a result. So I think in storytelling and telling their view, because that's the important part, giving the students a voice.
Mm-hmm. We talked about policy and thinking about educational policy being let's see, sorry. Let me just reframe it and say that if a lot of educational policy has moved towards, an achievement level, which, kind of reifies the current social status in school rather than addressing systemic issues of inequity and segregation and so forth in our school systems. What are some policies, if you were in charge, how would you move, what kinds of policies would you move towards or would you put in place?
Oh man, so I get to wave the magic wand. You've empowered me to wave the magic. So I think there's so much work, right? And I think that the same way when you look at the school to prison pipeline, it's important for us to acknowledge, if we're talking from an educational lens, from the education department, I think again, we have to sort of think about the way we prepare the professionals that we've entrusted to do some of the most serious work, and that for all intents and purposes still provides social mobility, right? For a lot of folks, it's still one of the few areas and fields where individuals can make a living doing something they're passionate about, have good benefits, and make an impact in the lives of our children. So I think it's in the preparation. I think it's in grappling and understanding. And I realize I've been saying that a lot, but it really is a struggle to acknowledge the parallel. This is the School to Prison Pipeline Forum. So I can tell you that there are some real serious, deep-rooted parallels between police, between the police and the criminal justice system and the school system. You want to talk about unions, you want to talk about hiring practices, you want to talk about the mobility within the organizations, you want to talk about who has influence and who doesn't. And are we really serving the interest of the students? Is that at the core? Because sometimes some may argue that no, we make decisions based on adults, right? And so what is the triangle? How do we make decisions? Well, the triangle is between, maintaining some sort of homeostasis between, central leadership and building leadership and the adults and the parents, right? And the union. And so long as all those three constituencies are good, then it really doesn't matter what we do to the individuals we should be focused on, which are our students, right? So all of that, it requires us to really reimagine and re-envision the way we bring people into the profession, the lack of diversity that exists by way of, various getting a lot of folks involved in it. So kind of getting young people in their junior and senior year to think about education, to think about the opportunities that existed. I remember early in the game when I was going through my, I earned my social work degree, and somebody was like, "Oh, you should come work in a school," right? And so much of this is introspective and getting and I knew back then, like, hell no, you're not gonna get me in a school. Like, the school is where all the issues lies. You know how much damage the school system did to me? I still remember when I was 14 years old and I had failed every class that year and I had the worst attendance and I had gotten involved in so many different issues, and I go to summer school and I got into a conflict, and the summer school principal walks in with a smile and says, "You can't come back." And I remember that, right? I remember the teachers that told me I never amount to nothing, right? Doubling down on this same self-doubt that I already had, these insecurities that I already had, right? That I was trying to sort of make up for by engaging in these activities that really were just meant to fill that void. And I remember all of that. And I amplified those voices more than I did the voices that told me how much talent I had, how smart I was, how I had leadership, how, you know, and it's not until now that I sit back when people ask me, how did you do it, right? Oh, you look at what you've accomplished. None of this is Sergio Aguetta, none of it. It's my mother, it's my family, it's those teachers that along the way, some whom I may not even really remember, but inculcated in me a sense of you're destined for greatness, right? You deserve more. You got it. And that is what carried me through. I'll never forget when I was in Baldwin. I went from Hempstead High School to Baldwin, y'all. Like, I got kicked out of Hempstead High School freshman year. I earned 1 credit, horrible attendance, horrible. When I tell my kids, I've been training for the position of dean since I was 12, 13 years old, right? You can't pull one on me. But when I got to Baldwin, I'll never forget, you know, my probation officer used to come to Hempstead High School once in a blue moon. I never did anything, never really. But I remember when I first got to Baldwin, and her name was Miss Stewart, my guidance counselor, white woman, older female. She called me in because the probation officer was there. You know, we had a small conversation and the person left. And then she told me, you will not have a probation officer, right? And even right now, when I'm just speaking to you, I haven't said her name. I've never mentioned her, but she came to me. You understand what I'm saying? So like, these are the people that have carried me through, that invested, that watered, that seeded, that gave light to. And we all have that potential on the screen. So that's more or less like the things that we need to do and understand that every single day, we have the potential to impact a young person in a positive manner.
Okay, I'm going to chime in here because we're running in the last few minutes here. And this is such a rich discussion. I hate to end it, but we do. We have a few minutes. So I want to thank Dr. Dalton, Goodman, Lippincott, Sergio Aguetta, Marilyn Jones Oliver, soon to be doctor. I appreciate you and everyone who participated in this. And I just wanted to share this little study here. I read theroot.com. I would suggest everyone in attendance here to look at theroot.com. They have some really interesting articles. And this one just caught my eye the other day. And it was titled, "A Judge Asked Harvard to Find Out Why So Many Black People Were in Prison." They could only find one reason, one answer to that question. And that answer to that question was systemic racism. And I posted it in the chat, the link to this article. But they go on to say it wasn't black on black crime, it wasn't violent video games and rap songs, had nothing to do with poverty, education, 2-parent homes, international bootstrap shortage. When a judge asked these researchers, without explaining why Massachusetts Black and Latinx incarceration was so high, a 4-year study came up with one conclusion: racism. It's always racism. And I'm going to stop there because that, to me, it captures, you know, what we're talking about here. If the school to prison pipeline is what the window of opportunity that we have to stem the tide of, you know, this stream of you know, mass incarceration. I believe at the first session a few weeks ago, I talked about the Dred Scott decision from 1857, where they said no black person has any rights that a white person is bound to respect. And the 13th Amendment, how it has a loophole that says that, yes, slavery is abolished, but for one exception. And that one exception is if you commit a crime, you know, but if you are always being charged with a crime and being, you know, harassed and, you know, on trumped up charges, no pun intended, but, you know, yeah, you're gonna end up in the criminal justice system. You're gonna be incarcerated. You're gonna find out that your opportunities are going to be, you know, extinguished. So, you know, I'm encourage you all to, you know, read soon to be Dr. Marilyn Jones Oliver's study when it comes out, and also follow, you know, soon to be Dr. Serge, because he wants to get his doctorate too. So we're gonna put that in the universe. and he's going to come up with some real, I think, transformative, research out there that really, makes a difference. So again, I want to appreciate everyone and thank everyone. And we have another program coming up next week on the Innocence Project. So, same bat time, same bat channel, come back. Thank you.